Welcome to this explainer. We are skipping the long intro today because honestly, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're diving straight into a timeline that is, well, it's almost impossible for the human mind to fully wrap around. We are talking about the violent, fiery birth of our universe and exactly how this rock we call Earth formed out of just pure, unadulterated chaos. So buckle up and let's get into it. 2 billion. Yep, 2 billion years. That is the staggering estimate for how long it's been since our planet was violently ripped away from the sun. We're looking at 2 billion years of cosmic explosions and massive transformations that literally paved the way for everything we know today. Which naturally leads us to a pretty mind-bending question, right? How exactly did a swirling cloud of flaming gas, just floating out there in a completely hostile void, actually turn into the solid ground we walk on right now? Let's start our cosmic zoom in and find out. Section 1. The Cosmic Birth, a 20 billion year tale. So, astronomers estimate the universe's age to be up to an unfathomable 20 billion years old. And it's incredibly fascinating how modern scientific insights sometimes intersect with really ancient texts. Take this ancient verse, for example. It gives us this beautiful, poetic framework that actually brilliantly illustrates the modern scientific concept of the universe being torn apart. It talks about the heavens and earth being joined together as one single unit before being cloven asunder. And here's what's really wild to think about. Before the planets even existed, everything in the universe was just these massive, glowing clouds of inflamed gas swimming around in an endless void. We call these nebulae. They were made up mostly of hydrogen and helium, and they just gradually shrank and condensed over unimaginable amounts of time to eventually form stars. Section 2, Torn from the Sun. A violent cosmic event. So how did Earth actually form? Well, I'll tell you one thing, it definitely wasn't a quiet, peaceful process. According to a really prominent theory, it started when another massive star approached our sun. This crazy cosmic encounter created an immense gravitational pull, which literally dragged a gigantic tongue of fiery gas right out of the sun. This fiery mass eventually detached, started orbiting, and then, slowly but surely, cooled down to form our planet. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this cosmic event, just consider the mass of the Earth that eventually formed from that cooled gas. We are talking over 5,000 billion tons. I mean, wow. A massive, unimaginable rock born from a single, violent gravitational pull. Section 3. The molten core. Inside the Earth. Now, if we compare the surface of the Earth to what's going on deep inside, the contrast is absolutely stark. The crust we walk on today, it's actually just a super thin, cooled-off layer. But if you were to drill down about 4,000 miles, you would hit a highly pressurized, densely packed metallic core that is mostly made of superheated, completely molten iron. And this simple metric perfectly illustrates the immense heat we're talking about here. For every 100 feet you dig straight down, the temperature actually rises by 1 degree Celsius. It is a constant reminder of the inescapable heat that's been trapped inside since the Earth's very early days. It is quite literally still boiling right beneath our feet. Section 4. Cooling down the crust, from magma to rock. Of course, it took eons for the Earth to actually transform into a solidifying rock. At first, it was just this explosive magma phase with a totally boiling surface. Any water was completely vaporized into these gnarly sulfurous gas storms. But as the heat slowly receded, the rocks finally began to solidify. And those thick vapors, they condensed, wrapping the entire planet in this dense, incredibly heavy cloud cover that completely blocked out the sky. Section 5. The Endless Rains. The Great Deluge. Just try to picture this scene for a second. Those scalding vapors finally cooled enough to form thick, dark clouds. Then violent, chaotic winds absolutely battered the planet without any mercy, and then the rain started. Torrential rains began to fall, and they kept falling for potentially millions of years. Just an endless deluge. All that hot water relentlessly bombarded the newly solidified, sizzling crust, carving out deep trenches and forming the very first boiling oceans. Section 6. The Lifeless Oceans, the Azoic Era. And that brings us to the final destination of our zoom in today, the Azoic Era. Azoic literally translates to lifeless. Picture a dark world totally covered by deep, literally boiling oceans under a permanently overcast sky. You've got bare, rocky mountains jutting out, just getting battered by constant rain. There's zero soil. There are no plants, no algae, and absolutely no living creatures whatsoever. It was just a chemical void of heat, water, and rock that lasted for up to 800 million years of complete barrenness. Which leaves us with one massive, incredible mystery. In a violent, hostile world of boiling water and massive storms, a world completely devoid of biology, with no soil and no plants, what was the magical spark that woke this barren planet up? What kicked off the incredible journey of biological life? Well, that is the million-dollar question that keeps us endlessly exploring. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the ultimate survival story. And I don't just mean human history with its dates and kings. No, we are going way, way back. We're looking at the entire geological and biological record to see exactly how life continually upgraded itself just to survive. So, picture this. How does a boiling, toxic rock spinning in space eventually become a world absolutely teeming with giant reptiles and highly complex mammals? Because long before any of the familiar epochs we know, Earth's atmosphere was incredibly hostile. We're talking a swirling mix of volcanic gases where life as we know it seemed completely and utterly impossible.
We're going to treat the history of Earth like a massive chronological journey, basically leveling up through these major geological eras. We start in the Aeozoic era, which literally translates to no life, over 800 million years ago. Then we jump into the Paleozoic, or ancient life, shift gears into the Mesozoic, the middle life, and finally land in the Cenozoic era. And every single one of these eras represents a monumental upgrade in biology.
All right, let's jump right into level 1, the oceans. Life's very first spark happened right here in the cooling waters, which became the ultimate testing ground for early biology. And what's really wild is the sheer scale of these early creatures. I mean, imagine sea scorpions growing to the size of a modern surfboard. The fossil record shows these absolute monsters reaching up to 9 feet long. Alongside trilobites developing the very first hard armors, this era eventually culminated in what scientists call the Age of Fish, where jaws and fins truly began to dominate the deep.
Moving right along to level 2, the daring leap to land.
As the Carboniferous period brought forth these massive, swampy land masses, aquatic life was essentially tempted to pull itself out of the water and step onto the muddy shores. But this wasn't just a physical step, it was a total mechanical revolution. To actually survive outside the water, creatures had to adapt their swim bladders, which were originally just used for buoyancy, to actually hold air. Eventually, these developed into primitive lungs, allowing these biological pioneers to finally breathe atmospheric oxygen.
And to give you a sense of what this environment was like, early insects, like primitive butterflies, reached an incredible 29 inches across in these dense swamps. The atmosphere in those Carboniferous forests was intensely rich in oxygen, and the environment was just so perfectly suited for growth that everyday bugs were flying around with the wingspans of modern birds of prey. It's just wild to think about.
Now, the crucial point here is that while amphibians unlocked the ability to actually walk on land, they were still completely tethered to the water for reproduction. Just like modern frogs, they laid soft eggs that would dry out on land, and their young still required a purely aquatic phase to survive. So they were kind of stuck halfway between two worlds. That evolutionary tie to the ocean just wasn't fully cut yet.
Which brings us to level 3, the Age of Reptiles.
As massive ice ages struck and those ancient swamps dried up, life had to level up all over again to survive. The earth became harsher, drier, and vastly more demanding. Only the creatures that could adapt to living entirely away from the water's edge were going to make it. And this marks the ultimate terrestrial upgrade, laying eggs on land. By developing eggs with hard protective shells, reptiles could incubate their young on dry land. When those hatchlings emerged, they were completely ready to breathe air and walk. Life had finally severed its last tie to the ocean and was free to conquer the interior of the continents.
And this biological freedom, it led to the absolute dominance of massive dinosaurs. Without the restriction of staying near water, reptiles scaled up to unimaginable sizes, reaching staggering lengths of 84 and even 100 feet. So while behemoths like the Giganosaurus and Diplodocus literally shook the ground, pterodactyls took to the skies. We also see the Archaeopteryx showing the very first signs of feathers, serving as this incredible evolutionary bridge to modern birds.
But it wasn't just on land.
Even the reptiles that returned to the sea, like the plesiosaur, grew to enormous, terrifying proportions. They basically realized the oceans were still an all-you-can-eat buffet. The scientific texts actually describe these magnificent marine predators as having necks much longer than an Iraqi goose, attached to these massive bodies with powerful flippers that let them absolutely dominate the shallow seas.
But as we know, the era of the giants couldn't last forever. Enter Level 4, the Age of Mammals.
A shifting climate left the colossuses that relied on the warm, highly stable climate of the Mesozoic entirely unequipped for a rapidly changing Earth. Around 80 million years ago, as tectonic plates clashed in incredible geological upheaval, literally pushing up massive mountain ranges like the Alps and Himalayas, the planet experienced alternating waves of extreme cold and warmth. And through all this chaos, a previously obscure group of small creatures began to thrive. To survive this new, unpredictable reality, mammals introduced some incredible new survival mechanics. They traded scales for insulating hair and fur, and they started incubating their young internally for better protection. Unlike cold-blooded reptiles that needed the sun's ambient heat, mammals could generate their own body heat. By carrying their young inside and nursing them after birth, mammals guaranteed a drastically higher survival rate in those freezing, harsh climates.
With the rise of grassy plains, these warm-blooded animals formed complex societies. They started relying on intelligence and community rather than just sheer size. And this is where biology gets truly fascinating. They started developing much larger brain capacities, using distinct warning calls to protect the herd, and most importantly, mothers began actively teaching vital survival skills to their offspring. It was a total game changer. This increasing brainpower and complex social structure eventually laid the groundwork for a highly specialized branch of mammals. When you look at early cave art, it is a powerful testament to a creature that didn't just survive in its environment, but observed it, recorded it, and manipulated it with tools. This marks the defining moment where biology began to give way to technology and culture.
So what happens when one specific group of primates decides to leave the trees, stand upright, and pick up a tool? Well, that sets the stage perfectly for our next explainer, where we'll uncover the fascinating and complex dawn of early humans. You definitely won't want to miss how our direct ancestors leveled up to literally conquer the globe. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
So when exactly did it happen? Have you ever wondered about the precise, exact fraction of a second in history where our ancestors actually crossed the line from just surviving like animals and sparked the real fire of human ingenuity? Well, let's find out. The human spark, an evolutionary fast-forward. Today, in this explainer, we're basically hitting the fast-forward button on millions of years of history to dive into the definitive milestones of our deep past.
Section 1. The beginning. Standing upright.
Let's jump back, way back, 40 million years ago. Primates are just emerging in these dense tropical forests. But then, fast forward to 600,000 years ago, and bam, the first ice age hits. By 50,000 years ago, the fourth ice age is at its absolute peak. This brutal, extreme shift from a massive global summer to literally freezing ice forced our ancestors into the ultimate ultimatum: adapt or die. And that brings us to Pithecanthropus erectus, often known as Java Man. These early ancestors did something absolutely revolutionary for the time. They stood fully upright. Now, why does that matter so much? Well, standing on 2 feet completely freed up their hands to actually manipulate the world around them. And that specific change paved the way for a brain far, far larger than any ape's. Section 2. The Stone Age Revolution. From Rocks to Tools. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. At first, early humans were literally just picking up sharp rocks they found lying around by chance. We call those eoliths. But then, a massive cognitive leap happened. They started intentionally striking flint to craft tools during the Paleolithic era. And eventually, they're actually polishing and specializing these tools in the Neolithic era. We went from just surviving our environment to actively shaping it. And you've got to appreciate this next part. Think of it as the smartphone of the Stone Age, the bone needle. I'm serious. Along with the bow and arrow, this tiny invention was a massive, game-changing technological leap. It completely transformed how humans lived, allowing them to stitch together warm clothing and actually survive the brutal ice. Section 3. The Great Discovery of Fire and Accidental Brilliance. Just picture this accidental brilliance for a second. Maybe it was sparks flying from a struck stone or dry branches rubbing together in the wind. Early humans witnessed this terrifying, raw force of nature and somehow bravely learned to control it. Taming fire changed absolutely everything. It completely defeated the brutal cold of the Ice Age, it kept deadly predators at bay, and it allowed us to finally cook meat and roots for much better digestion. And that cooked food, it was absolutely vital fuel for our rapidly growing brains. Section 4. Neanderthal versus True Human, a tale of two species. This was literally a clash of brains versus brawn. You had the Neanderthal, who relied heavily on a heavy jaw, sheer brute strength, and, believe it or not, a really restricted thumb movement. But then you have the true human, or Cro-Magnon. They had a taller stature, a forward-thinking brain, and some seriously complex tool variation. So these true humans migrated from the southern and eastern regions, moving directly into Neanderthal territory. And because they had much better communication and advanced weaponry, they hunted big game like mammoth, bison, and wild horses with incredible efficiency. Ultimately, they outsurvived and entirely replaced the Neanderthals. Section 5. The Dawn of Human Art, the ultimate proof of consciousness. The breathtaking details of these ancient archers and deer are just incredible to witness. Because this isn't just an image, this is visual, undeniable proof of early humans actively reflecting on their own world. Think about the sheer dedication here. Early humans ventured deep into the pitch-black caves of France and Spain, with absolutely nothing but flickering firelight to guide them. And right there in the dark, they engraved wild horses, rhinos, and deer onto rocks and animal bones. Now, this is an absolutely crucial point to take away from this explainer. This art was created for aesthetic pleasure and imagination. It wasn't just for survival. It wasn't a practical tool for hunting. It was a profound, beautiful expression of inner life and truly the dawn of the human mind as we know it. We literally went from striking rocks together to painting our very souls on cave walls. So it leaves us with a pretty massive question. What will our modern cave art be for humans a million years from now? Will it be our technology, our data, or something else entirely?
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is easily the greatest, most complex, and honestly, the most consequential software upgrade in the history of our planet. We're talking about the evolution of the human mind. We're going to trace this unbelievable arc, going from pure instinct-driven survival in the darkest caves all the way to the complex, philosophical thought that defines us today.
Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to take a second and contrast yourself with your earliest ancestors. I mean, it's truly mind-blowing when you think about it. Right now, you're sitting there with this incredible modern ability to read, to analyze abstract concepts, to watch this explainer, and to ponder your own existence. But if we rewind the clock, our ancestors definitely didn't have the luxury of philosophy. They were literally hiding from apex predators during the Ice Age. Their brains were entirely focused on the immediate, terrifying present. So how exactly did we cross that massive canyon from mere survival to actual consciousness?
Just look at the constant vigilance required in this prehistoric reality. The world was dark, it was scary, and it was completely unforgiving. Our physical brains had to adapt just to keep our bodies alive. The human mind back then was largely reactive. You hear a twig snap in the dark, boom, your brain floods with fear, and you run. This terrifying pressure was the harsh crucible that essentially forced our early hardware to adapt.
Section 1. The Spark of Consciousness.
For millions of years, the precursor to the modern human mind functioned a whole lot like an animal mind. It was driven almost entirely by instinct, repetition, and immediate physical needs, like finding food or a place to sleep. Early human species, like the Neanderthals, were originally driven by this instinctual fear. But then, something miraculous happened. A spark, a profound shift toward imagination and conscious thought. Instead of just reacting to their environment, early humans began to actually hold concepts in their minds, connecting complex ideas together. And that right there is the very spark that separated us from the beasts.
Now, this transition from a fearful, mute existence to a life guided by conscious thought, it definitely didn't happen overnight. Our ancestors were absolutely terrified of the dark, terrified of storms, and terrified of the wild animals hunting them. It's kind of wild to realize that our modern, analytical minds were literally forged in the fires of prehistoric anxiety. Our ancestors started to use their newly developing imagination not just to hide, but to predict, to plan, and to outsmart the environment that was constantly trying to kill them.
Which brings us to version 1.0, the invention of language.
Think about how a baby learns to speak today. They babble, right? They imitate. Well, early human language developed in a remarkably similar way. First, our ancestors started by imitating the sounds of nature and the animals around them, the rustling of trees, the roar of rushing water, the call of a bird. Slowly, over vast stretches of time, these imitative noises were refined into distinct intentional syllables. And finally, we made the greatest leap, developing grammatical rules to string those syllables together into complex, meaningful sentences.
It's actually fascinating to look at the sheer primal nature of our vocal origins. Early researchers literally tried to create a quote-unquote dictionary of monkey language, and they found distinct primitive sounds. For example, they recorded sounds like tits-tez to express anger or disgust, and a sort of ha-ha sound to express joy and playfulness. It's a bit funny to think about, but those basic emotional grunts and vocalizations, they are the primitive roots from which all human poetry, science, and debate eventually sprouted.
Just look at that number, 250,000. To put that into perspective, we went from starting out with a handful of emotional grunts and nature imitations to a modern language like English today that boasts well over 250,000 words. The sheer scale of this cognitive expansion is absolutely breathtaking. We went from basically warning each other about a tiger in the bushes to having the vocabulary to discuss quantum physics and global economics.
Section 3, version 2.0, from pictures to alphabets. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact turning point. Before we had letters or keyboards, early humans drew on cave walls. This was the very first attempt in human history to record ideas outside of the physical brain. It was a way of saying, hey, I was here, I saw this, and I want you to know about it even when I'm not standing right here to tell you. It's literally the grandfather of all modern text.
Once we figured out we could record thoughts visually, communication technology accelerated at a breakneck pace. We started with those simple cave drawings. Then, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia began pressing cuneiform shapes into wet clay. The Egyptians took it a massive step further by creating hieroglyphs and writing them on lightweight papyrus, which made information portable. And finally, the Phoenicians developed the alphabet.
The invention of the alphabet was truly the ultimate cheat code for human civilization. I mean, instead of memorizing thousands of different pictures for thousands of different words, the Phoenician alphabet broke human communication down into a small set of basic sound symbols. You could combine a couple dozen symbols to represent absolutely any sound the human mouth could make. It meant that for the very first time, human knowledge could outlive the person who spoke it. Information became immortal, a real game changer.
Section 4, coping mechanisms and the emergence of myths.
You know, we often think of myths today as just entertaining fairy tales, but for our ancestors, they were way more than that. Myth and magic were essential psychological survival tools. They were early humanity's attempt to make sense of and exert some level of control over the terrifying, unpredictable natural forces that constantly threatened to wipe them out.
Imagine being an early human, completely lacking any modern scientific understanding. You look up and see a solar eclipse turning day into night. No way, right? You experience massive thunderstorms with deafening lightning, or devastating floods that literally wash away your entire camp. Because they couldn't scientifically explain these phenomena, their highly active imaginations filled in the blanks. They began to believe that nature was driven by unseen spirits, demons, or gods that desperately needed to be appeased.
The contrast here is absolutely crucial. Without myth, early humans faced primitive fear, an utter, paralyzing helplessness against the random chaos of the world. But with mythological control, by inventing gods of thunder, spirits of the river, and rituals to appease them, early humans gained a psychological sense of agency. The invention of these early belief systems was a direct, visceral response to fear. It was humanity trying to negotiate a peace treaty with a terrifying and arbitrary universe.
And that brings us to Section 5, the climax, the dawn of philosophy.
So what does this all mean? The crucial point is understanding this exact pivot. Mythological thinking was all about finding psychological comfort. It used stories and magic to make the dark just a little less scary. But philosophical thinking,
introduced by early thinkers like the Greeks, was radically different. It was about seeking objective truth. It was about setting aside those comforting stories to look for strict logical rules, cause and effect, and the fundamental mechanical essence of reality.
This quote perfectly captures the Platonic shift that really changed everything. Humanity was finally using reason to decode the actual mechanics of the universe. Instead of assuming a thunderstorm was an angry god throwing a tantrum, philosophy asked, what is the physical nature of the cloud? What is the essence of the lightning? We basically stopped hiding from nature, and we started studying it.
The journey of human thought we just traced is nothing short of miraculous. We started at the absolute bottom, driven by pure, reactive, physical survival. Then, our brains upgraded, sparking an imagination that created languages and myths to cope with our fears. Finally, we upgraded again, developing writing and applying strict logic to seek objective truth. Every single step built the foundation for the modern mind you are using right this very second. The whole shebang.
Which leaves us with one incredibly exciting and honestly perhaps slightly daunting final thought. Our minds spent millions of years evolving specifically to conquer and understand the natural world around us. Now that we've mapped the globe, split the atom, and decoded our own DNA, what exactly will our minds evolve to conquer next? Really think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to decode the fascinating world around us.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we aren't just looking at history. We are stepping way back into the terrifying, totally unforgiving world of ancient prehistory. We're going to trace the sparks of humanity. You know, those massive physical and mental leaps that allowed our ancestors to not just survive, but eventually dominate the entire globe.
Seriously, how did a completely defenseless species conquer Earth? Just think about the human body for a second. Against the brutal forces of the ancient world, we were remarkably vulnerable. We didn't have thick hides, venom, sharp claws, or even the speed to outrun the massive predators of the time. We were just a soft, defenseless species dropped right into the middle of a ruthless food chain. So how on earth did we actually conquer it?
Well, to survive that Paleolithic struggle, our ancestors obviously couldn't rely on brute strength. They had to rely on observation, teamwork, and innovation. They literally had to engineer their way out of being prey. They used their minds to build a barrier between themselves and the terrifying wilderness around them.
To understand exactly how they did this, anthropologists break our timeline into three major stages of evolution. First, savagery, marked by fire and hunting. Then, barbarism, where we see agriculture and settlement. And finally, civilization, bringing metals and writing. Section 1. The physical sparks, fire and farming. Because before early humans could sit around pondering the universe, they absolutely had to secure their physical survival against freezing temperatures and starvation.
You know, the very first technological breakthrough was almost certainly an accident. Early humans likely discovered fire completely by chance, maybe from a natural forest fire sparked by lightning, or just a lucky rock strike when they were making tools. But recognizing the power of that accidental spark, that changed absolutely everything.
Harnessing the flame wasn't just about getting warm in brutal climates. It actually catalyzed our very first industries. It cooked meat and tough roots, which unlocked massive amounts of calories for our growing brains. It also scared away nocturnal predators so our ancestors could actually get some safe sleep, and eventually it allowed us to bake clay into pottery to store food and water long term. Now, let's fast forward to a massive turning point, 12,000. That's about how many years ago the agricultural revolution began. Up until this exact moment, humans spent basically all their time just chasing food. But this shift fundamentally rewired human society forever.
The dawn of farming definitely didn't happen overnight. It started simply with gathering wild, naturally occurring grains. Then, over time, humans began observing seed growth. This eventually led to intentional planting and harvesting, and finally, establishing permanent settlements. We stopped wandering, and we started building villages.
Moving on to our next section, mastering the Earth, the Metal Ages. Having mastered plants and the surface of the Earth, humanity looked deeper, extracting raw elements to mold to their absolute will.
We often group the Bronze and Iron Ages together, but looking at bronze versus iron, the technological jump was massive. Bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin, melts easily and shapes quickly. Iron, on the other hand, is a completely different beast. It demands extreme heat, complex extraction, and exhausting, repeated hammering. It was basically the high-tech of the ancient world.
And because iron was so incredibly hard to extract from the Earth, early humans actually got it from space. No, really.
Early iron tools, like King Tutankhamun's famous meteoritic dagger found in his tomb, were literally forged from fallen meteorites. Because it literally fell from the sky and was so difficult to work with, iron actually terrified and mystified people. As the quote goes, iron was initially considered impure in ancient Egypt, known as the bone of Set, Set being the god of chaos and storms. It was this massive leap in technology met right away with mythological fear.
Which brings us to the next section, the mental sparks controlling the unseen. As societies grew, we needed a psychological way to cope with the terrifying, unpredictable forces of nature. We really needed to feel like we could control the unseen.
This deep desire for control gave birth to what we call sympathetic magic. Basically, it's the primitive belief that imitating an event or drawing it can magically cause it to happen in reality. This was early humanity's first, admittedly flawed, attempt at science. The logic made absolute sense to them. If you draw a successful hunt on a cave wall or imitate rain through a dance, you can magically force it to happen. They were trying to enforce order on a completely chaotic world.
But soon, a really fascinating division occurred. We see this split between magic versus deception. On one hand, you had sympathetic magic, which were genuine, albeit flawed, attempts by the masses to control nature and survive. On the other hand, you had deception and illusion. Early shamans and leaders realized that using tricks to create the illusion of magic gave them immense social power.
Yeah, ancient priests used literal magic tricks. Historical sources point to some incredible ancient illusions. We're talking about ventriloquism at the Oracle of Delphi to fake the voice of gods, hidden flammable drawings in temples that would suddenly ignite in the dark, or even feigned invulnerability to fire or poison. These were ancient special effects, designed purely to maintain awe and obedience.
And that leads right into our final section, the origins of belief, explaining the unexplainable. Because beyond magic tricks, humans needed a broader framework to explain massive natural phenomena. Anthropologists track a very clear evolution of belief here. It started with a raw fear of natural elements like storms and floods. Then it evolved into animism, the belief that spirits lived in all things like trees and rivers. From there, it shifted upward to worshiping celestial bodies like the stars and the sun. And finally, it crystallized into polytheism, where those local forces were given faces and names as deities and gods.
When it came to appeasing the storm, early religious rituals really were born out of a desperate need for safety. Think about it. If a storm is just chaotic weather, you are totally helpless. But if it's a conscious being, well, then you can negotiate. So, rituals and sacrifices emerged as attempts to negotiate with those overwhelming forces of nature.
Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. As this quote puts it, to the primitive mind, the sun, rain, and storms were not weather, but conscious, independent powers. Without modern science, these forces could bless your harvest or literally destroy your entire village in a single afternoon. They absolutely demanded respect.
So from striking rocks to make fire, to forging meteorites, to creating complex belief systems to understand our world, we literally engineered our way out of the food chain. We took a soft, defenseless body and used our nines to tame the elements. Looking back at this incredible and honestly often accidental trajectory of our ancient past, we engineered our way out of the food chain and tamed the elements. What will be our next great leap?